Bueno, buenos días a todos. Bienvenidos a la anteúltima sesión del Seminario Junior del Instituto Gregorio Millán Barbani. Hoy tenemos a Hassin Yousaf del Departamento de Economía, que nos va a hablar sobre predicciones y resultados de los tiroteos en colegios en Estados Unidos. Así que muchas gracias, Hassin.
Thank you very much for giving me the chance to present. So it's a bit different. So I'm always presented in front of the economics crowd. So I don't know if I go over something very fast or if I'm not clear about something. Please interrupt me and ask me anything. And I would really, I think, benefit from all the comments you can give and all the perspective I can gain on this paper. This paper is part of my PhD thesis, so I'm doing PhD in economics in Carlos III, but it's in Getafe, the campus, and so I'm going to talk about the main paper of my PhD thesis. So the title is Sticking to One's Guns, Mass Shootings and Political Economy of Gun Control in the US. So as from the title, it's clear what it's going to be about. It's going to be about this phenomena of mass shootings in the US and how does it make people think about the gun policy and what changes it brings about in the elections and in politicians, how they go about this policies, the gun policies specifically. So first, let's define what are mass shootings. So I guess if you follow the news, the international news, you might have come across this term, but let's properly define what mass shootings are. So mass shootings are shooting incidents in which at least 4 or more people are killed in a single event. So it's like a shooter, he goes in a public place, either a school, a mall, a restaurant, or other places, and 4 people are killed in that incident. So that's how the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, defines mass shootings. And these phenomena of mass shootings are of interest in economics because they are recently on the rise. Unfortunately, if you're following the news, you see that the 2 of the biggest mass shootings in the history of United States just happened within the last 2 years. So last year you saw the mass shooting in Las Vegas, in which 60 people were killed and more than 500 people were injured. And in the same way, before that was the mass shooting in Orlando, in which around 50 people were killed as well. So the main focus of this paper and the main idea is that what happens is that when mass shootings happen, people start talking about gun debate. So they start discussing what should we do about the gun policy. And if you're familiar with the US politics, there are traditionally 2 sides to it. So there are the Democrats and the Republicans. And they have completely different stance on what should happen as a result of mass shooting and what should be the gun policy which could address these problems of mass shooting. So on the one hand, you have Democrats which say that you should have you should have restricted access to gun control, so not everyone should have access to guns, and we should really limit the guns which are there in the public. While the other stance is Republican stance, which is essentially that everyone, it's the fundamental right of every citizen to have guns, and we should give access to guns. And if individuals have access to guns, they can actually prevent mass shootings because they can kill the shooter. So there are these 2 spectrums of political debate, and the main idea of this paper is to see after mass shootings what happens, which side wins, why does it win, and how do politicians change their stances, if any, on mass shooting. So basically these are the 3 main research questions which I will study in this paper. Yeah.
The Republicans, they say that if you have guns, you can bring down the shooter.
Exactly. Yeah. So it rarely happens. So it happened like among all the mass shootings, it happened once in the 250 mass shootings, let's say. So it's very, very rare. Usually it doesn't happen, but it's their stance. Like they really, if you follow their political debates, they really push that this would help. And the main thing is that so one thing is what happens statistically, and the other thing is what voters believe. So voters might not be perfectly rational to look into exact statistics and say, oh, it never happens. We can really, this platform is really doesn't make any sense. They really try to follow what the politician is saying and might not infer if that's far from truth or not. So that's another aspect. So what are the main research questions? The main research questions are, what are the political impacts of mass shooting? So that's the broader question, and within those within that question there are three categories which I would address in this paper. So one would be, do mass shootings impact the electoral outcomes? So do we see any particular political party systematically winning or losing where the mass shooting takes place? If so, how does mass shooting change the voters' preferences on gun policy? So I will talk about this towards the middle of the presentation, when I come to defining voter preferences and defining policies, gun policy and other policies. And finally, do mass shootings actually impact gun policy? Do mass shootings impact how politicians actually put their stance out on the gun policy? So just to quickly go over it again, why do we care about this topic? So it's again coming from economics, so I don't know if this might appeal to you as a science crowd, but if you think that there is another point which makes it important to study mass shooting, please do let me know, and that would be really great for my paper. So first, as I told you before, mass shootings and gun policy have become a topic of interest in its own right, simply because the mass shootings are on the rise in the US. So later on I will show you exact time series of mass shootings, but just to give you some numbers, mass shootings in the early 2000s and before, there were around 5 mass shootings every year, so they were a bit rare. But since 2005 onwards, there are more than 10 mass shootings every year. And at the same time, gun policy is becoming an important topic in the electorate. So before 2000s, people were not so keen or not so interested in what politicians have to say about gun policy. But since 2005, we see that the gun policy has become also more important. So more and more people base their votes specifically on what politicians have to say about gun policy. And at the same time, if you see how the voters are thinking about gun policy, it's interesting that the electorate has become divided and is becoming even more divided on gun policy. So just to show you the time series of evolution of behavior, so here you have these two groups which I told you about, the Republicans and the Democrats. So one stance was the Democrat stance, which is gun control. You should have control to access to guns. And the other stance is gun rights, which is the Republican stance, which is essentially saying that you should have access to guns, which might prevent mass shootings and which is also a fundamental right of the citizens. So if you look at the evolution of these two behavior, here it plots every year how many individuals are for each stance. So how many people are for gun rights, the Republican stance, and how many people are for gun control, the Democrat stance. If you see, the difference between them is diverging. In more so like from here it might seem that the opinion is shifting towards more gun rights. But if you zoom into this picture, if you really see how gun policy and gun preferences are changing among the two types of voters, the Republican and Democrat, you see the divergence more clearly. Here it plots how the Republican voters think about gun rights and how the Democrat voters think about gun control. So you have these two different types of voter who before were, let's say, more undecided. So half of the Republicans and half of the Democrat thought gun rights and gun control were the right policy systematically. Now, if you zoom in into 2015, around 80% of Republicans and 80% of Democrats respectively think that gun rights and gun control is the right stance. So you see that more over time, not only that the mass shootings are increasing, but also the electorate is becoming more divided. They don't know, they argue more over which is the right policy to implement. So, And secondly, this is an important topic because what we I'll come back towards this right in the end, that what we learn from mass shootings can be thought of as a broader, can be generalized and can be thought of applicable in other issues as well and other cases as well. So in particular, what I'll distinguish between in my paper would be there are two roles of issue weights and issue preferred policy. So that would be basically shifting across issues. You can have gun policy, tax policies, and other policy. Once you see mass shootings, you could simply say taxes are not as important, people are dying, I value more gun policy. So that could be a shift from other policies to gun policy. And the other dimension is that essentially before you thought that everyone should have access to gun, but now you see mass shooting and you change your stance. That's within gun policy what you think. So I will make a distinction between these two, and what I will argue is that it's important to distinguish between these two, and what we learn from how people really change across issues and within issue is important and can be thought of applicable to other issues as well. And in the same at the same time, what is nice about my case is that I will show you later that these mass shooting events are almost as good as random. So these mass shootings, if you try to predict them based on any local characteristics you have, economic, crime, health, gun, and other socioeconomic demographic outcomes, you cannot really predict when and where mass shooting will take place, which really helps in the identification. And which is not true for other issues. So if you think about other issues such as immigration, trade policy, and environmental policy, those issues are not as good as random because immigrants choose to go in certain places and not in the other places. While in my case, I will show you that mass shootings, you cannot make the same argument for there. Mass shooters don't systematically target certain areas and not the others. It's essentially that these guys just get a snap and start shooting someone in the public, and the mass shooting takes place there. Okay, so just a quick example what a mass shooting is. Probably it's already clear, but just to make things even more clear, is that on October 1st, 2017 in Las Vegas, a 60-year-old guy named Stephen Paddock started killing people from his hotel into the concert, and he ended up killing 59 people and injuring more than 500 people. So this is a very typical kind of mass shooting in a lot of ways, and although it was the deadliest mass shooting, it's still very typical in the sense that the mass shooting was carried out by a guy who did not have any political or criminal motive. He was just shooting there for whatever for whatever reason we can't rationalize, and that's what a typical mass shooting usually is. It's not done for criminal or political motive. It's done by people who get a snap and they start shooting people. So what I would do in the paper would be first construct county level data of mass shootings in the US from 2000 to 2012. So I will follow the official FBI data source, and also I will collect the data from media and other sources. And what I did in the end, I have all the list of mass shootings in the US from 2000 to 2012, and I have it at the county level. So just to give you an idea how small the county is, so there are almost 3,000 counties in the United States. So county is smaller than a congressional districts. There are around 400 congressional districts and 50 states. And a typical county has a population of around 90,000. So you can think of it as half or 1/5 of, so half or 60% the size of Getafe, more or less. And so what I show first is that mass shootings are largely random events. So if you try to predict when and where mass shooting takes place based on local characteristics, you cannot find anything. You cannot say that mass shootings are taking place in areas which are economically more challenged, or have more access to guns, or have some other problems. I'll show you that the areas which have mass shooting look very similar to areas which do not. And then what I'll do is I'll use a difference in difference strategy to identify the causal impact of mass shootings on political outcomes. So what is a difference in difference strategy? A difference in difference strategy compares the changes in outcomes. So change in, for me, would be the political outcomes. Changes in political outcomes in counties without mass shootings to changes in counties with mass shooting. And then it tells you that this is the impact of mass shooting. Okay, so in order to in order that this identification strategy works, this different strategy is good, is when your control group and treatment group are very similar. So the idea is that mass shooting, where the mass shooting takes place, are the treatment groups. The mass shooting where the places where mass shooting does not take place are the control groups. If these two groups are very similar, I can implement the defensive strategy, and what the result I will get, I can attribute it as a causal impact of mass shootings. Okay, and in particular, the three main variables of interest would be the electoral data. So in the electoral data, I will have bunch of results from elections. I will have presidential, gubernatorial, senatorial, and house elections. Then I have then my main other variable of interest would be the survey data, trying to distinguish between the role of issue weights and issue preferred policy. And finally, trying to see how do politicians vote on gun policy, how do they specifically vote on gun specific issues in the Congress. So just to give you a quick preview of results, so what I find, what I will find towards the end would be that the Republicans lose on average 4 percentage point in all the federal elections. So it doesn't matter if you look at presidential, gubernatorial, Senate, or House elections, they lose around 4 percentage point across the board. And this effect does not disappear just after one election. So if there's a mass shooting, Republicans don't just lose in that election and then recover. It just they lose 4 percentage point, and it stays like that for at least 3 more elections. I find stronger impact of mass shooting close to the election and swing counties. So in areas where people are more undecided, so the swing counties are area where there are more undecided voters. They are there the impact is stronger. And at the same time, if the mass shooting happens closer to the election, the impact is stronger. And at the same time, I don't find any impact on people going out to vote more. So I don't find any increase in turnout, and I don't find any difference in the incumbent vote share. So the already incumbent politicians, they don't systematically win or lose due to mass shooting. Now, at the face value, if you look at this result that the Republicans are losing 4 percentage point, going back to the discussion I briefly mentioned before of across issues and within issue, you can think that what's happening here is that people are becoming anti access to gun, or becoming pro gun control. So they are becoming anti-Republican and pro-Democrat. But what we need to think about is also the role of shifting your stance, shifting your weight across issues. So the idea could be here that once you see mass shooting, before you were of a certain stance that was favorable to Republicans. So suppose you were, for simplicity, imagine there are only two policies, just for simplicity. So one is the tax policy and the other one is the gun policy. Before the mass shooting, you were your preferences were in a way that you put more weight on the tax policy, just because you thought tax policy rather than gun policy, just because you thought we care about taxes every day. It happens like we have to pay the burden of taxes every day, and gun policy is not of relevance to me. Then you see mass shooting. What could happen is that you shift your part of your weight from tax policy to gun policy, because you think that, oh, mass shootings are much more common than I thought, or mass shootings are actually occurring in my area. Then one reason why Republicans may lose is just because of this, because mass shooting shift the weight from other issues which are favorable for Republicans to issue in which Republicans are not so favored. And the other thing could be what actually happens about what actually takes place in the policy in your actual stance. So you could actually shift from being pro-gun access to gun to anti access to gun or pro-gun control. So what I find is not the first effect is the one which is dominant. So the main reason why electorally Republicans lose is the first thing, that you are witnessing voters shifting their weight from other issues towards gun policy, while the average guy in an area is still has the same level of preference when it comes to access to guns. So he doesn't want restricted access. An average voter does not want restricted access to gun. It's just that an average voter shifted his weight from other policies towards gun policy. But at the same time, you see an interesting result, which is essentially that mass shooting increased the divide between Republican and Democrat voters. So if you break down this distribution of average voter, and if you look at how those voters who voted for Republicans in the past and Democrats in the past change their preferred policy, they change in exactly the opposite way, which is that those who voted for Republican in the past asked for increasing access to guns, which is the Republican stance. And those people who voted for Democrats in the past, they asked for decreasing access to gun, which is the Democrat stance. So you see that as a result of mass shooting, what's going on is people are becoming even more certain that what their political party proposes as the solution is the correct solution. And then you have these two groups which are more fight more with more animosity towards each other, and really make the gun policy making even more difficult, because you have two groups which are even more sure that they have the right solution. Okay, so because I think I would not have time to discuss a lot towards the end, so I will skip this part. So what the main, just to give you a quick overview here, the main contribution of my paper would be in three different literatures. So first would be the specific literatures on what type of policies should be taking place in guns, or gun policy and mass shootings, and there is limited evidence on how gun policy takes about. Rather, there are more evidence on what are the consequences of gun policy. So my literature would fit into this debate by showing that what could be possible determinants of gun policy. Then this argument which I made before, that people shift votes across issues and also their stance within issue, is something which is not discussed in the empirical work. So within economics there are two different types of work. So theoretical works, which is models, and then the empirical work, which is essentially looking at the data and trying to conclude what actually goes about in the real world. And if you look at the empirical work, there is no distinction between what happens as a result of a shock or as a result of whatever. How do the electorate changes its preferred policy, and how does it change its issue weights? And what my contribution is to trying to distinguish between these two factors and trying to show empirically that it's relevant. It makes a difference if you focus on issue weights or preferred policy, and it matters for policy making. So which is clear from a more recent working paper in which one author argues in the same way that it might be very different if you focus on only preferred policy or if you focus on issue weights. And finally, this result of political polarization, it's a new phenomena. So if you're aware of discussions in the media, and if you're following especially the US politics, but also the UK politics and European politics, you have a huge increase in polarization among voters. So before, what you used to see was that most of the voters were in the middle, and they supported one party or the other based on let's say the candidate they particularly had in that election. But what's going on more and more so is that you have two types of voters. One is on one side and the other one is on the other side, and no matter what happens, it doesn't change who they would vote for. And probably you saw this in the recent US elections, in which they were despite how the Republican candidate was actually was, people still voted for Republicans just because they are hardcore supporters of Republican political party. And that's essentially a new phenomena, and what economists are trying to see is trying to understand how can that go, why is that going about, and why is political polarization actually increasing. And my main contribution there is that in the economics literature, mostly people have focused on economic factors, so factors such as trade and financial crisis. My point there is that, look, other factors which are non-economic, such as gun policy, such as mass shooting, could also make people more polarized. And the same way, one of the extensions which I have in mind of my paper would be to think about how religion, how stances on different cultural issues such as abortion, rights of lesbians and gays could also play a role in making these two different groups diverge even further. Okay, so that was just a quick overview. That was a quick summary of the paper, and now I'll get into a bit of detail about my paper. So I'll just quickly go over what mass shootings, what are mass shootings in a bit of more detail. So the number of mass shootings every year, how many people die, and then I'll discuss my empirical strategy. The empirical strategy is essentially trying to measure the causal impact of mass shooting. Then I'll discuss my results, the mechanism and results on polarization. I don't think I will have time to discuss results on heterogeneity. And finally, I will conclude. So these are the annual number of mass shootings every year in US from 2000 to 2012. And as you can see that in the first half of 2000, there were very few mass shootings. So there were on average between 5 to 10 mass shootings every year between 2000 and 2005. Then in the second half, if you look, and I stopped working until 2012, but I can, what I will do in the future would be to extend the data towards 2016. What you see is that the number of mass shootings are only increasing with time. So there are on average between 10 to 15 mass shootings in the second half of 2000. Not only that, but also you see that the mass shootings are becoming more deadly. So you see that the threshold to define mass shooting is only four people killed, but in actual mass shooting, 10 people can be killed, or it can kill a lot of people more than only 4 people. So this plots how many how in an average mass shooting in a particular year, how many people die. So you see that again in the first half of 2000, around 5 people were dying in a mass shooting, while if you look at the second half of 2000, more than 5.5, around 6 people are dying in a mass shooting. So it's not only that number of mass shootings are increasing, but also mass shootings are becoming more deadly. And that's just to present it in another way. If you look at the mass shootings, the biggest mass shootings in the last 25 years, 4 of the 5 biggest mass shootings happened within the last 10 years. And so what do we already know about mass shootings from the economics and other literatures? So there is very little research in economics. We don't know much on what are the causes and consequences of mass shooting. We know a bit about mass shootings through the criminology literature. What are the basic statistics, basic facts on on mass shooters or mass shootings? So what we know is that a typical mass shooting is carried out by a 20 to 40-year-old white male, and he does not have any political or criminal intent to carry out the mass shooting. And this is essentially a recent paper which just says that we understand, or we know very little on what actually causes these shooters to go about killing people. And Grant Dewey is one of the leading criminologists who has written books on mass shootings, recounts in his book that no one knows why public mass shooting takes place, and those people who blame it on violent video games or availability of weapons are really missing the mark. So essentially, we are clueless on why mass shooting takes place. What I will do is I will try to see if we can predict mass shooting based on local characteristics or not. And that's going to be one of the contribution of the paper, that what they have argued I will try to show that statistically that's true. Like, based on local characteristics, you cannot predict when and where mass shooting will take place. And at the same time, more recent hypotheses about access to gun and mental illness also don't bear any fruits. So these are the location of mass shooting in the US. So if you see from this map already, you can tell much that the mass shootings are not concentrated in certain areas. It's pretty much all over the map. What you can see is that there are few mass shootings here because if you know about the US geography, there are very few people living here in Nebraska, Oklahoma, and in the middle, in the Midwest states. And most of the and if you zoom out from this area and look at the other areas, pretty much you see mass shooting take place in every area. What you see potentially as a correlate of mass shooting, which I will also show later that it's statistically true, is that mass shooting takes place in more populated areas, which makes sense because you need to kill 4 people. So if there are very few people to kill, essentially you don't have mass shooting there. You have homicide, but you don't have mass shootings. So what I will do in my empirical strategy is trying to say, controlling for population, let's see if we can predict when and where mass shooting takes place. And that's going to be my empirical strategy. First, let me tell you again what my main variables of interests are. So what I'm interested in is to measure the impact of mass shootings on political outcomes. So what kind of political outcomes I have in mind are 3. So the first one are the electoral outcomes. Electoral outcomes, what do I mean by electoral outcomes? I mean Republican vote share, the turnout, and the incumbent vote share. Then the second outcome, trying to understand the mechanism, trying to distinguish between the role of issue weights and role of preferred policy. I will use the survey data, trying to understand how does the importance of gun policy changes and how does the preferred gun policy changes among voters. And finally would be the third piece of the puzzle, which would be to look at how politicians react to these events. And there I would analyze the roll call voting in the Congress data. So it's essentially the data that every politician votes on a specific issue in the Congress, and that's called the roll call voting. And from there I would see systematically if the politicians who are elected from areas where mass shooting takes place, they differ systematically from those places in which mass shooting do not take place. And here I will have both the measure of their overall ideology, so it will be a measure of how Republican or how Democrat they are, but also an ideology specific to gun issue, so how Republican and Democrat they are on gun specific issue. So this is the main empirical specification that I would estimate in my analysis, and I will have a bunch of robustness and other measures to make sure that it's not sensitive to only this particular specification. So here my main variable of interest is YCT, which are the political outcomes. These political outcomes are measured in county C in election T, and again, just to remind you that the counties, there are on average 3,000 counties in the US, and the election T is there are presidential elections and Senate presidential election every 4 years, and then there are House elections every 2 years, and the gubernatorial elections are also every 4 years, while the senatorial elections are on a rolling basis, but on average they are also every 4 years. So here I will control for county fixed effect. So alpha C is county fixed effect, which basically means that I will control for all those factors which are invariant across time for a specific county. So factors such as where the county is exactly located, what's the geography of the county, how the institutional setup, which does not change over time, are captured by these terms. So what alpha C would help me in would be that I can forget about all the changes or all the differences in level across counties and just focus on how the political outcomes change across counties. Alpha T would control for all the time fixed effects. So this would be essentially the idea that in a particular election, people might vote very differently from the other. So in that particular election, people can have a specific set of candidates and they might vote differently, or there might be some national shocks just before election. There is, let's say, a national crisis, global financial crisis, and people might vote differently just because of that. So all these things which are potentially at the national level, which affect all the counties in the same way, are controlled by alpha t. Then XCT would be a vector of controls. So I will put in a bunch of controls. I will show the results without controls and also with controls. The vector of controls would include the controls on demography, economy, gun, crime, and health related variables. Then the main variable of interest, the main parameter I'm interested in estimating is beta. Beta is the parameter which is on the interaction between MSE and post. What is MSE? MSE is it's a dummy equal to 1 if the county has mass shooting during the sample period. So that's defining which places have mass shooting or not. And post CT is the dummy equal to 1 for all the periods after a county has a mass shooting and 0 otherwise. So essentially, if you focus on what beta would measure, beta would essentially measure how the political outcomes change in counties where mass shooting takes place relative to counties where mass shooting does not take place before and after the event. And then there is just a minor technical point that I will cluster the standard errors at the congressional district level. So usually what you do is you cluster the standard errors at a higher level. And congressional, as I told you before, that congressional district, there are on average 400 congressional districts in the US. So what is the identification assumption? So the just to tell you quickly what this means is, so in order to measure causal impact, you cannot just run an OLS. If you run an OLS, you could have this problem of your main variable of interest, which is the interaction between MSE and post, could be correlated with U. So if you have a correlation between MSE times post and U, you cannot, the estimate of beta you will get would not be unbiased and consistent. So you cannot rely on what you get in the case when you have a correlation between MSE post and U. So the assumption I need for beta to be correctly measured is called identification assumption. In my specific case is that conditional on county fixed effects, areas with and without mass shootings would have evolved in the same way. So it's a counterfactual argument that if the mass shooting did not take place, you would have exactly the same level of exactly the same evolution of political outcomes in counties where mass shooting take place, or with respect to mass shooting, with respect to counties where mass shooting do not take place. And obviously, because we only observe one case and not the other, so we only observe counties where mass shooting takes place afterwards, and we don't have their counterfactual. What we do is that we will provide evidence in favor of this assumption by showing that they were very similar before. Also, they are very similar on both levels and trends in other outcomes, and you cannot predict where mass shooting will take place. All of this together is essentially showing that areas where mass shooting take place are not special, so it's not something very particular about those areas which generates the results. And also, you cannot predict where mass shooting takes place. So mass shooting do not occur in specific areas itself. So what do these results show us? So if you carry out an event study around mass shooting, so this is essentially saying, let's compare the areas where mass shooting takes place and where mass shooting do not take place in all the periods before and after the election. So if there was something particular about these areas, you would see that you would see that before, because if these areas were already different from the areas where mass shooting takes place, you can detect that by looking at how different they are. So here, if you look at how the outcome, the Republican vote share is different in presidential election between counties with and without mass shooting, you see essentially that the point estimate is very close to 0, and the confidence interval is big enough that the 0 lies within the confidence interval, which essentially means that counties with and without mass shooting do not have a difference in political outcomes before the election. 3 periods before, 2 periods before, 1 period before, and so on. And the same could be said for other elections as well. So presidential elections are every 4 years, so you have fewer data points. But if you look at let's say house elections, you have more data points, and you can see that even 9 election periods before the mass shooting, the areas where mass shooting takes place are very similar to area where mass shooting do not take place. So essentially from here what we learn is that had the mass shooting not taken place, we cannot say what would have happened because it's a counterfactual, but given what we saw in the periods prior to mass shooting, the areas with and without mass shooting were very similar. So there is no reason to believe, other than mass shooting, that these areas would have behaved in different way after mass shooting. In the same way, another argument in favor of the identification assumption would be that comparing areas where mass shooting takes place to areas where mass shooting do not take place on other outcomes. So not on political outcomes, but on demography, socioeconomic and other outcomes. And there the idea would be to detect if mass shootings are systematically taking place in one area and not the other. So if you try to see how are areas where mass shooting takes place and not with respect to the other, so this difference tells us the difference in levels. So this for example the first number 0.008 tells us what is the difference between a difference in turnout in areas where mass shooting takes place relative to areas where mass shooting does not take place. And you see that the difference is very, very close to 0, and if you look at the standard error, essentially it's not different from 0, which points out to this idea that the turnout between mass shooting areas with mass shooting and without mass shooting are very similar. You cannot distinguish between these two counties based on turnout. And the same argument applies if you look at other outcomes. So if you look at where mass shooting and areas with mass shooting and without mass shooting, they are very similar on the the proportion of whites, the proportion of blacks, their education, how the marital status, population dynamics, median income, unemployed, poverty, crimes, killing by gun, and their health status. And the same applies to their trends. And what are trends? Trends are essentially how these variables are changing across time. So it's not they are very similar on level, but also on trends, which means that for example, if you look at the number there, 0.001, the turnout. So how is the change in turnout in areas where mass shooting takes place relative to areas where mass shooting do not take place? And essentially you see that nothing comes out to be statistically different in areas where mass shooting takes place to areas where mass shooting do not take place. And this again makes us confident that what's going on here is not that mass shooting are taking place in specific areas. If you look at this table, you cannot essentially distinguish between areas with and without mass shootings on any of these outcomes. And the same could be said if we try to predict all of them together. So all the factors together, all the electoral, demographic, economic, gun and crime and health outcomes together, to see if they collectively, jointly predict when and where mass shooting will take place. And you see that essentially nothing predicts mass shooting. So these are the electoral outcomes. So past Republican vote share, past turnout do not explain where the mass shooting will take place. And also if you look at the other factors, you don't see anything. So essentially again what this is telling us is that you cannot pinpoint where and when and where mass shooting will take place. They are as good as random, and the areas where mass shooting will eventually take place were very similar prior, and the results which we see after mass shooting could be attributed to mass shooting itself, because these areas they didn't have something specific about that. So then there are more refinements to this identification strategy, which I would not spend time on, because if later you would like to discuss this with me, that would be great. But is that these 4 identification strategies rely on much weaker assumptions, and they generate similar results, which essentially again makes us confident that what we are getting is the causal impact of mass shootings. So what are the main results? So first, you see that if what happens to the Republican vote share in areas where mass shooting takes place relative to the other. So this is the estimate of beta. This is MS time post, the main variable of interest, and this is the estimate of parameter beta. So you see that in areas where mass shooting takes place, Republicans lose on average 4.4 percentage point relative to areas where mass shooting do not take place. And it's the same if you control for nothing or you control, you add all the controls. And the results are also same if you consider other elections. So what happens in the gubernatorial, senatorial, and House elections. So it seems to be a systematic loss for Republicans across the board. Just to put exact numbers on what does it mean, what this 4 percentage point actually means in terms of number of votes. So again, going back to this, what happens in an average county. An average county has a population of 90,000 individuals with a turnout of around 53% and a Republican vote share of around 55%. So my results of 4 percentage point would imply that in an average county, Republicans would lose around 2,000 votes. And these number of votes are significant if you look at close elections. So if you remember the famous election between Al Gore and George W. Bush in 2000, what essentially happened there was that Al Gore lost the state of Florida by 500 votes, and essentially he lost the presidency just because of losing Florida. And my results essentially imply that if there was a mass shooting in Florida in the 4 years prior to the election in 2000, we could have expected different results. So you see that these mass shootings do not impact the aggregate outcomes in non-close election, but in elections which are closely held, such as the famous 2000 election or the recent one in the 2016 election, you can have alternate outcomes. Okay, so these are a bunch of robustness tests which I would not go over because it's essentially doing different specifications, measuring the variables in different ways, trying different identification strategies, and showing that the results I get are similar with this as compared to the ones I got before. Now, in terms of mechanisms, this was what I was explaining in words. You can put it mathematically in one compact equation like this. So suppose for simplicity you have a multi-dimensional voting model, so you have a lot of dimensions. You have you can vote how you vote based on what's the tax policy, what's the economic policy, environmental policy, immigration policy, gun policy, and other policies. So for simplicity, let's just abstract from this n-dimensional voting space and focus on only 2 dimensions: how you vote on gun policy and other policies. So the other policies are all together. So you can think about the other policy as a sum of all the tax, economic, environmental, and other policies. So if you look at this, this is your utility from voting, a very simple utility from voting. If you look at this equation, what you see here is that how you vote depends on essentially 2 parameters. So alpha G is how much you put the weight on that particular policy. In this case, alpha G would be how much weight you put on gun policy, and alpha minus G would be how much weight you put on other policies. And theta star G would be your stance exactly on gun policy. So how you vote according to how close your stance is to the stance of the political party which proposes a particular stance. And you vote like this on both gun policies and other policies, and this is the utility function you get. Now, as a result of mass shooting, what could we expect? We could expect 2 things to change. One is alpha G. Essentially, now you saw the mass shooting and you say, no, mass shootings are really important. They are happening in the public, and I was not putting enough emphasis on mass shooting, and maybe I should. So you could expect alpha G to change, or you could see a change in stance. Theta star G may change, which is essentially that I was before focusing on having this as the right policy. However, as a result of mass shooting, I think that this is not the right policy and there should be a different policy to be implemented. So again, stressing my contribution is that the empirical papers do not distinguish between these 2 factors, while I would. So here, this is a theoretical argument on what could happen if alpha G and theta star G changes. So if if alpha G increases, if you put more weight on gun policy, who would win? It's essentially a very simple argument. It's very intuitive to imagine that if you change your if you put more weight on gun policy, the political party which has a relative advantage in gun policy would win. So if the average guy is Republican, the Republican would win. If the average guy is Democrat, the Democrat would win. And if the average guy is exactly in the middle, no one would gain or lose, because he's exactly indifferent between Republican and Democrat. While on the other side, if the theta star G changes, if your preferred policy changes, you could expect again two things. If the theta star G changes towards the Republicans win. If it moves towards the Democrats win. And if essentially it does not change, you don't see any changes in political outcomes. So what I will going to do is measure this using the survey data. How do I measure that exactly? Is through these two questions. So the importance is measured. How important is gun issue to you personally? And the other one is the preferred policy, which is, do you think that the federal government should make it easier to buy guns, make it more difficult, or keep the rules just the same? And I will have the same strategy to estimate what happens to the importance and the preferred policy of gun specific issue. So what I find is that the importance of gun policy systematically increases in area where mass shooting takes place relative to areas where mass shooting do not take place. And I don't see any difference in increasing access to gun or decreasing access to gun. So essentially what's going on is that people are shifting from other policies towards gun policy. So when people see mass shooting in their area, what's going on is they shift their votes from tax, environmental, economic, immigration, or whatever policy you can think of towards the gun policy. But at the same time, they are not shifting their stance. So they are not essentially saying an average guy, so again, an average guy is not shifting their stance. So on the aggregate, you don't see anyone, you don't see these areas systematically becoming more Democrat or more Republican. But if you zoom in, if you really try to see what's going on within these voters, so rather than looking at an average voter, you look at how Republicans and Democrat voters are behaving. They are behaving exactly in the opposite way. So when you look at first at the Republican and Democrat voters, you see that the importance of gun policy increases among both of them. So when the mass shooting takes place in your area, regardless of whether you're Republican or Democrat, you shift your issue weights from other policies to gun policy. So when you see mass shooting, gun policy becomes more important. But if you look at how these people change their specific stance on gun policy, you see the divergence between them. So you see when mass shooting takes place, those individuals who voted for Republican in the past, they systematically ask for decreasing gun control, which is asking for increasing access to guns, while Democrats behave in the opposite way. The Democrats, when the mass shooting takes place in their area, the Democrats ask systematically more for increasing gun control. So essentially you see that to the same event, so the same mass shooting, two different types of voter are reacting in the opposite way. So you have this case of no change in the average, so the average remains the same, but you have a skew in the distribution along the tails. So both the Republican and Democrat, there are more people now on the tails while keeping the aggregate the same. So it's a mean preserving spread essentially. And how can you rationalize this argument through a Bayesian updating model? So theoretically you can rationalize this this result if you have this kind of model in mind. Sorry. So suppose there are two states of the world. So the one state is the stronger gun control can prevent mass shootings. The other state is stronger gun control cannot prevent mass shooting. A priori, you don't know in which state of the world you are. So you don't know the actual state of the world. You just observe mass shootings, gun policy, and other outcomes. So each individual only observes the policy X, so what is the gun policy, and a noisy outcome of policy. It could be mass shooting, it could be homicide, it could be other outcomes. And as a society, everyone agrees that they want to minimize a common loss function. So they want to, let's say, minimize the number of homicides, number of mass shootings. But there is a divergence on what is the probable likelihood of being in state 1 and state 2. So Republicans, if Republicans are more likely to believe that a certain state is true, so if Republicans are more likely to believe that state number 2 is true, which I can see in the empirical in the survey data that that's true. If they look if they then observe mass shooting, they would diverge even further. So if the mass shooting takes place among people which have what is called heterogeneous priors, so these are heterogeneous priors because Republicans think state 2 is more likely, Democrats think state 1 is more likely, and then what happens is mass shooting takes place, it just makes them even more certain that state 2 is more likely and the state 1 is more likely, respectively. And this is one way of rationalizing the results I observed, but there are other ways as well, such as conformity bias and other non-Bayesian updatings as well. So with this, I will just quickly go over what I find for the politicians, and then I will conclude. So essentially what I find for politicians is exactly the same, that areas where mass shooting takes place, in aggregate, you don't see any change in how these politicians are voting on gun-specific issues in the parliament, in the Congress. On the aggregate, on the average, there is nothing. But if you look at how these two types of politicians, Republican and Democrat, are voting on gun-specific issues in the Congress, you see a divergence. While Republicans are going towards increasing access to gun, Democrats are going in the opposite way, which is decreasing access to gun. And it does not matter if you measure the gun ideology as on a continuous scale or on a binary scale. So essentially, what's going on is an average guy is not changing their preference, while at the same time you have these two groups which are becoming more Republicans becoming more Republican and Democrat becoming more Democrat. Okay, so I don't think I will have time to present heterogeneity, so I will jump towards conclusion, which is essentially just to tell you again what I find and how can these results be important. So mass shootings, what I found is mass shooting impact the political outcomes. Republicans lose around 4 percentage points in counties where mass shooting takes place relative to the others. Preferred gun policy diverges among the voters. So people become even more uncertain over what the gun policy should be, and at the same time, the policy making also, the politicians also start diverging, the Republican and Democrat, on gun specific issues. So these results in general highlight how the changes in electoral outcome may not reflect changes in preferred policy. So you saw that Republicans lost, but an average voter did not become anti-Republican. And at the same time, this shows how political polarization can be going on. So how people react to common signal in diverging ways. So in general, what we learned from this could be applied to other issues as well. So for other events which make issue more salient could have certain mechanisms in play as well. So for example, if you think of other issues such as immigration and refugee crisis, so for instance, there was this recent Brexit issue, and then recent immigration of influx of refugees from Syrian war. What could happen is that you might see that right-wing political parties, so that's another result which we saw, right-wing political parties which are generally anti-EU start winning politically, so they start getting more votes. But the idea there, what my paper would add to that discussion would be that what is going on is that as a result of refugee crisis, people are not becoming anti-immigrant. It's essentially what's going on are people are shifting their votes from, let's say, tax policy to immigration policy, and generally people are conservative or people are more right-wing on immigration. So if there is this refugee crisis, it's not people are becoming anti-immigrant, it's just that people are shifting from other issues towards immigration issue in which they are traditionally conservative or more in favor of right-wing. So yeah, that's all I have to say. Thanks.
Si ¿Alguien tiene alguna pregunta? O sea, que levante la mano. Bueno, I have a question. Maybe it's more technical, but when you study the weights on the policies, you say alpha G is the weight for gun policy, and alpha minus G is for everything not gun policy. Isn't that 1 minus alpha G?
Exactly, it will be 1 minus alpha G. So it's
why do you consider those as different things?
no, it's just a matter of notation. But yeah, essentially alpha minus G is 1 minus alpha G. Exactly. So it's the same thing, but like you're substituting weight. So in total, you have 100% of the weight. You can choose where to put the weight. Yeah. So that's true.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean,
It's just a matter of notation.
Trick for statistics to
Yeah.
account for things that you don't know. But
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah. Exactly. It's the same thing. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Anyone? No? No questions? Okay. So thank you, Hassin.
Thanks very much for inviting me.